Imagine a stormy summer night in Geneva, the air heavy with ash from a volcano an ocean away, and a small circle of restless, brilliant young minds daring each other to outdo the ordinary. Picture a woman, barefoot maybe, notebook on her knee, who, amid dares and opium-soaked conversations about life and death, conceives a story about a scientist who builds life and a creature who learns to hate the world for having been made. That woman is Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, later Mary Shelley, and the scientist she imagined would haunt readers for generations. But the story of Frankenstein is only one thread in a far stranger, rawer, and more human tapestry, the life she shared with Percy Bysshe Shelley. Their partnership was part muse, part collaboration, part rebellion, and it asked the hardest questions about genius, grief, and responsibility. Let's settle in at the beginning. Mary was born in 1797, the daughter of two radical figures, Mary Wollstonecraft, the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, who died days after Mary's birth, and William Godwin, the political philosopher. From childhood, Mary absorbed ideas about liberty, education, and the rights of the individual. She grew up in a household where books were as many and varied as the visitors who drifted through, poets, philosophers, and revolutionaries. Against that background, she became precocious, thoughtful, and fiercely curious. Percy Bysshe Shelley was older, born in 1792, a man already burned by controversy. He had been expelled from Oxford for writing a pamphlet on atheism. He married briefly, but found marriage to be a constrictive institution. He was a radical in politics and in love, quick to idealize, quick to repudiate social conventions in the name of liberty. When Mary and Percy met, they were still very young, he a charismatic, articulate iconoclast, she a bright, attentive woman who had read widely and absorbed her parents' intellectual daring. Their path to each other was messy and modern. In 1814, when Mary was only 16, Percy and Mary eloped to Europe. They traveled through France and Switzerland with little money and great ambition, a fugitive couple in the romantic sense. The elopement scandalized polite society. Percy was technically married to Harriet Westbrook, and Mary was the daughter of a famous philosopher. They returned to England in straitened circumstances, and tensions followed between duty, social expectation, and the raw urgency of the life they wanted to live. The Shelleys' life together would be punctuated by dazzling highs and devastating losses. Their financial insecurity was constant. They lived by wit and borrowed funds, relying on sympathetic friends and occasional patrons. They also carried a radical moral code. Percy and Mary rejected conventional constraints, held radical political ideas, and associated with other bohemian minds who both helped and complicated their lives, most famously Lord Byron and Claire Clairmont. In the summer of 1816, at Byron's villa near Geneva, the notorious weather forced the group indoors. The famous ghost story contest, Byron's prompt that each guest write a supernatural tale, set the conditions in which Mary's imagination answered with Frankenstein. She took the fragments of conversation about the principle of life and the frenzy of the storm awareness around them and turned it into myth. It's important to say, Percy's presence in Mary's creative life was real. He read her drafts, suggested improvements, and in some cases, supplied lines. But Frankenstein was Mary's mind primarily, her questioning of creation's ethics, her acute female perspective on motherhood and abandonment. Percy's help did not diminish her ownership, instead, it illuminates the collaborative climate they inhabited. They exchanged ideas like lovers and thinkers do. They argued late into the night, they wrote strands of prose and poetry to each other's margins, they encouraged and provoked, with all the tenderness and sharpness that close creative partnership brings. Their private life, tragically, was riddled with grief. Mary gave birth to 4 children in quick succession, 3 died in infancy. Only one, Percy Florence Shelley, survived to adulthood. Those losses are crucial to understanding Mary's work. Frankenstein is suffused with themes of maternity, creation without nurture, and the loneliness that follows. The horrors of child mortality in the early 19th century were not abstract statistics to Mary. They were the night vigils, the hollow cradles, the aching poems and silences that followed. When you read the creature's plaintive question, "I am malicious because I am miserable," you can hear not just Gothic hyperbole, but the sob of a woman who had watched life dribble towards silence too often. Percy was more than an editor, he was also an emblem of the romantic ideal, ardent, philosophically inclined, and sometimes dangerously idealistic. He wrote odes and political tracts that read like manifestos of compassion and revolt. He believed in human perfectibility, in love's power to transform society. He could also be self-destructive. His radical positions and disregard for creditors made life precarious. His pursuit of purity in feeling could translate into impractical decisions. Together, Percy and Mary embarked on journeys that read like an odyssey. They escaped to Italy in 1818, where the climate and culture revived them. Italy was, for Mary, a place of healing and work. She wrote, revised, and published, sometimes to acclaim, often to controversy. Percy flourished in poetic production. Prometheus Unbound and other lyrical dramas came from this period. The Italian years are lyrical in their details: long walks, readings of Plato by the sea, conversations about art and politics in the warm light of Tuscan villas. But even then, grief never fully left them. Percy's first wife's suicide and the deaths of their children were shadows that moved through rooms. Mary turned pain into craft, Percy turned longing into lyric. They shaped each other. Then, in 1822, their partnership was cut short in the most brutal manner. Percy drowned in a sudden storm while sailing off the coast of Italy. His boat wrecked near Lecce. The news of his death hit Mary like a physical blow. Her husband's body washed ashore sometime later. He was cremated on the beach, a grim, elemental ritual. Mary's grief was a lifelong companion, an undercurrent that shaped her decisions afterward. She outlived Percy by nearly 3 decades, and a substantial part of her life afterward was devoted to editing and promoting his poetry, safeguarding his legacy, and making public his radical ideas while trying constantly to humanize the man the public had reduced to myth. What makes their story distinct for our series is not merely the romance, nor only the literary genius. It's the messy human reality, a couple who pushed against the boundaries of their society, who dared live radically, a woman who wrote a foundational work of science fiction and then had to negotiate authorship, reputation, and widowhood in an age that did not protect women's intellectual labors, and a man whose brilliance was both a gift and a wound to himself and those he loved. Their relationship embodies the darker side of genius, inspiration and ruin in tandem. But we should also slow down and look at particular moments that shape their public and private lives. In London salons, young Mary argued philosophy with guests who would shape intellectual life. At times she wrote in the margins of books, composing sentences that later became central to Frankenstein's emotional logic. At other times in Florence, she transcribed Percy's notes into neat, private editions. She typed and she proofread, she championed his vision long after his body was gone. Percy's radicalism, the impassioned advocacy for political reform, for the liberation of oppressed peoples, for the abolition of harsh institutions, was foundational to their household's energy. He took on causes that sometimes had personal costs. His refusal to acquiesce to social norms isolated them, friends left, critics scorned, and economic pressures mounted. Yet Mary never abandoned that shared politics entirely. She absorbed it, transformed it, and folded it into her own moral imagination. And then there's the creative alchemy itself. Imagine 2 people at the same desk, one sculpting images in meter, the other drafting a cold, clinical line of Gothic horror that will always seem, upon later readings, to speak to the ethical violences of birth and parenthood. The Shelleys' letters reveal a back and forth, Percy planting ideas, Mary testing them, Mary pressing for human truth in a way that Percy's abstractions sometimes needed. Many of Percy's poems speak to Mary. He often names her in odes, and his ideals of love are built by and for her. She, in turn, names the human cost of those ideals within her fiction. Their story complicates the trope, the genius male and the passive muse. Mary was no passive vessel. When critics tried to insist otherwise, when publisher blurbs credited Percy or suggested editors had been more responsible than authors, Mary defended her own authorship. Her later editions of Frankenstein, notably the 1831 edition, included reflections in which she insisted on the novelty and independence of the work. She had to fight cultural assumptions that a woman could not have authored such a philosophically complex and frightening text. That fight was part artistic, part feminist, and part survival. After Percy's death, Mary's life took on a new structure. She moved to London, she raised Percy Florence, and she became the living archive of a literary age. Mary stewarded Percy's poetic estate with a fierce tenderness, editing, correcting, and arranging posthumous collections that would ensure that his voice continued to be read and considered. She also wrote novels of her own, The Last Man, a melancholy dystopia, haunted by loss and anticipating modern apocalypse narratives. The Last Man is often read now as a novel shaped by the twin forces of love and loss. Its lonely protagonist mirrors Mary's subsequent solitude. Mary's later years were not easy. She endured the social censure that followed their early elopement for the rest of her life, and many reviewers dismissed her later books. Yet she maintained friendships with other writers and intellectuals, she pursued travel, and perhaps most importantly, she refused to relinquish the complicated memory of Percy to cheap legend. She guarded his letters, heaped the care he deserved upon his reputation, and used what social capital she had to protect the small victories of Shelleyan radicalism. If we step back for a moment, what larger lessons does their partnership offer? First, that creativity is rarely solitary. Genius can take flight on the winds of collaboration and companionship. Second, that the cost of daring to live differently in a conservative age can be immense: social exile, moral judgment, emotional losses, but it can also produce artworks that change the cultural vocabulary. Third, that grief is not a single event but a life's condition for many. Mary's durable sorrow reshaped how she wrote, how she kept silence, and how she remembered. Now, let's make room for the quieter, human details that breathe life into any portrait. Picture Mary in the private rooms of her house, smoothing pages of Percy's poems, pausing at a line that shimmers and then exhaling. Picture Percy, waistcoat unbuttoned, pacing a moonlit terrace while reciting lines that sound like prayer. Picture them arguing, fierce, tender, about the rights of the poor, about how best to represent the suffering of others, about whether the imagination should be tethered by utility or allowed wildness. Picture them with a child tucked against Mary's shoulder, the future colliding with the present. And finally, let us linger with the closing, the long human closure this story deserves. Mary Shelley outlived Percy by nearly 30 years. She carried with her both the burden and the blessing of his memory. In the years after his death, she was not merely a mourner but a steward, an editor, and an outspoken preserver of radical ideals. She transmuted personal pain into public work, publishing, editing, and writing with a resoluteness that both honored Percy and asserted her own mind. The air heavy with ash from a volcano, her later novels, diaries, and letters show a woman who refuses to be reduced to tragedy. Each other to outdo she kept the complex portrait of Percy alive, a woman, the lover and the dreamer, notebook on the irritant and the muse. Amid dares and opium-soaked conversations about life and death, the fact of her authorship, a story about her intellectual labor, and her right to shape the story that history would tell. Having been made. Ask yourself, that when we celebrate genius, whose labor are we erasing? Later Mary Shelley. In Mary and Percy Shelley's story, the answer should be obvious. Genius never stands alone. But the story of Frankenstein is only one thread in a far stranger, steadied by companionship, and haunted by the cost of a life lived at the edge of convention. Their partnership was part romantic, part collaboration, but it is also part rebellion, and it asks that art be accountable to ethics, that creation cannot be divorced from responsibility.